Wellington.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and it's a pleasure to rise today to debate Bill C-288, an act to amend the Telecommunications Act, transparent and accurate broadband services information. Now, Madam Speaker, in fact, I was actually originally planning to speak to the predecessor to this bill on June 23rd, 2021. So there's nothing like 16 months of intervening time to allow me to really collect my thoughts on this matter. But I am pleased that my colleague, my friend from Dauphin Swan River, Neepawa, has revived his previous bill from the previous Parliament in this Parliament to provide Canadian consumers with the important information they need when it comes to rural broadband services across our country. So I thank him for raising this issue. Something that I've said many times in the House of Commons and in public with my constituents in public events is that reliable, high-speed internet ceased being a luxury a long time ago. For Canadians, for families, for businesses, for communities, it's an absolute necessity. And so when members are given the opportunity to bring forward private members' bills, there's often a lot of competing priorities that members see as being important for their communities and for their ridings. And so when someone wins the lottery and has a high up number in the private members' business lottery, like my friend from Dauphin Swan River, Neepawa, did, it's great that they're able to pick a priority like this that is important for folks in rural communities like Dauphin Swan River, Neepawa, but also in places like Perth, Wellington, and in rural communities across the country. In my community of Perth, Wellington, the issue of rural broadband is one I hear time and time and time again. Nearly on a weekly basis, if not sometimes on a daily basis, I'll receive emails from a constituent, a phone call from a family, even sometimes a printed letter in the mail, because sometimes their internet's so bad, asking when they might finally see rural broadband, fiber optic coming to their communities. In fact, just this morning I spoke with a business owner in Wellington North, in the north part of Wellington County, talking about how his business was affected by not having access to reliable high-speed internet. The speeds that he's able to get currently, based on his current internet service provider, are simply not adequate for him to be able to carry out his business. And in fact, Madam Speaker, later today, after I've downloaded this video and upload it to my website, to my Facebook page, to YouTube, many of my constituents in my riding won't be able to actually watch this video. They won't be able to watch it because their high-speed internet is simply not adequate for them to be able to watch it. They'll be spending most of the day buffering rather than actually watching this or any other video or business communication. So, Madam Speaker, there are challenges affecting internet across this country. And I'll be honest, it takes a lot of infrastructure. It takes a lot of infrastructure investment in order to get reliable internet and telecommunications services in a country as large and as rural and remote as Canada. But one of the challenges is that there are very few internet service providers in Canada, and this market is dominated by a couple of large corporations. And I don't think it's a surprise to anyone in this chamber who those large corporations are who dominate the marketplace. And this lack of competition, Madam Speaker, means that there's a lack of choice for Canadians. In many parts of my riding, in my constituency, my constituents have no choice and are stuck with one provider. In a lot of cases, that's old Ma Bell herself, Bell. And so there are several small, often community-owned internet service providers who are trying to do the hard work, to make sure that fiber gets along every concession road. They're trying hard, they're working hard, and they're committed to providing reliable, high-speed internet, but are often unable or are struggling to compete with the large internet service providers, who often, frankly, engage in marketing that, while legal, is really pushing the boundaries of what is believable and what is consistent. In my riding, I'm very proud of community and businesses like Quadro, Whiteman, and Mornington, who are very much working to connect rural subscribers, rural residents, with fiber optic internet service, where they can have up to 1 gig of download speeds, an amount that is simply unbelievable for so many in my community right now, because they're dealing with speeds as low as 2.5 Mbps, megabits per second, which is simply not sufficient to carry on a business, participate in community events, and communicate with family members. Canadians need accurate information about the speeds of their internet service, which is why I support this bill so much. The theoretical speeds, the hypothetical service, the best case scenarios, all these advertising mechanisms that some of these large corporations use, they hinder us. They prevent us from being able to make meaningful decisions when deciding what internet service provider to go with. But what does help Canadians, what does help consumers, is realistic expectations based on data regarding what the download and upload speeds are going to be with a specific internet service provider in their community. Now, Madam Speaker, let's step back just a little bit and look at what's been happening in the past number of years. Throughout the first 15 years of the 21st century, internet access expanded dramatically, and service and quality and speeds all increased during that period, albeit not always consistently across the country. But what we've seen in the last 7 or so years is that progress has slowed and has stalled. In fact, Madam Speaker, I would say that the progress of this government on expanding high-speed internet across the country has been slower than dial-up. And I've raised this issue time and time again about poor internet service with different Liberal members of Cabinet over these past 7 years. And unfortunately, the responses we always get are either disappointing or, quite frankly, misleading. The Liberal government has pointed to the different federal funds and dollar totals that they claim to have invested, but in typical Liberal fashion, they measure success based on the amount of money they spend rather than the actual results they achieve. You know, one small example is in November 2018, I raised a question during question period about a report that was criticizing the government's failed process to improve rural internet. And I raised this in question period, and the now Attorney General, the Parliamentary Secretary at the time, responded simply by telling me how much more money they were spending, how many more dollars were being put into it, rather than focusing on results. And here we are 4 years later, and people in rural and remote communities across Canada are simply not having access. Now, Madam Speaker, I'll note that some other strategies that have been promoted more broadly are on the issues of spectrum. And I would note that the government still hasn't followed up on the use it or lose it policy that would actually make sure that spectrum is actually used and not kept in corporate coffers as some kind of bargaining chip or future asset that they can sell or resell in the future. Many of these projects we've also seen being funded across this country have gone again to some of these large telecom companies rather than going to the smaller telecoms. In fact, I would note that the so-called rapid response stream of the Universal Broadband Fund gave $7 million of taxpayer funding in November of 2020 to Bell, whereas a lot of the small, local, often community-owned internet service providers in rural communities could have used that $7 million and actually got fiber in the ground. And I would note as well, Madam Speaker, in terms of the failure of this Liberal government, despite the fact that 10% of the Canadian population lives in southern Ontario, 10% of underserved population in southern Ontario, the Liberal government's Connect to Innovate program did not invest a single dime, not a single dime, in southern Ontario. So again, big show, lots of announcements, citing big dollar figures, but when you have 10% of the population not being served in southern Ontario, whereas there's a program in southern Ontario, the SWIFT program, for example, that's a collaboration among internet service providers, among municipalities, among counties, among private business, and hopefully at some point some further funding from different levels of government, they're there and they're ready to do the work necessary to make sure that fibre gets in the home of all Canadians. But yet, when we come to a program like the Connect and Innovate program, not a single dollar being invested in southern Ontario. So again, Madam Speaker, I see my time is dwindling down. I want to refocus why this bill is important. As the member for Dauphin Swan River Neepawa mentioned earlier, the phrase "up to speeds" is misleading types of advertising is simply not acceptable when Canadians are making important decisions about rural high-speed internet. So, Madam Speaker, we need to do more, we need to act, and I'm very excited to support Bill C-288. Thank you, Madam Speaker.